Well, before we move on, I want to say that, you know, it is true that it was it's a business move to be the city too busy to hate, but it was an advantage to be a community where the business owners and folks with the money chose prosperity over prejudice, because that was not true in most Southern communities. And so in the context of the 1960s, that was an enlightened perspective that again allowed then for the maneuvering of after the Voting Rights Act, a population that could be registered, that could be politically active, and could then begin to elect its own leaders, and to elect leaders like Maynard Jackson, who was very concerned about the cultural development of African Americans, concerned about the neighborhood development. The neighborhood planning unit process was put in place under Maynard Jackson, and it was something that he cared about very much. There was a time when actually Georgia State provided city planners. I think every community, every 2 MPUs had a city planner, and Georgia State had a school of urban planning that provided staff for that. You had the move then from, this is where you really had a Maynard Jackson talking about how do we use the political power to change the participation, the economic participation of African Americans. Emma Darnell did a study that showed that less than 1% of city contracts were going to African American businesses, 0 were going to women-owned businesses. And so he began the policy of joint venturing, requiring that companies that got contracts from the city would have to have 20% joint venture as part of that. And that was up and down the line. That was the bond company from the lawyers, that was the architectural firms, and he enforced that on the airport and held up the airport for a year. Until the business community accepted the joint venture initiative. And so even today, you see the big stadium that's going up. Russell Construction is one of the joint venture partners, on that multi-billion-dollar entity, and really created a different approach to doing business in the city. Now, when we get to the 80s, we'll find out some of what happened to that, again, because of national politics. But part of, and also Maynard was very concerned about cultural life. His aunt was an opera singer, and so he instituted this cultural affairs department in the city. He started doing grants for cultural affairs, and really made, I think one of the stories, he invited Babyface to come to and open up his studio in Atlanta. And so a lot of what we now see as this flourishing of music and filmmaking in the city really has its roots, because Atlanta was not a cultural, New Orleans was the cultural capital of the South. Atlanta was about business. We were not about culture, music, or any of that. That came really from Maynard's administration and his concern about the whole person, and that culture was an important part of a person's development, and therefore, as in his role as mayor, that he would do that.
Can you quickly, Ms. Young, just talk about MARTA and just the impact? Because in the 70s, it was a bus system until they implemented that.
So MARTA was, I think 1969 was that referendum. The deal that was cut, and actually Mayor Massell believed that that transportation was a right. And so the deal that was cut is that in exchange for the regressive sales tax, that the MARTA fare would be cut to 15 cents while the lines were being built. And so it was that persuaded people to vote for it, and I think it still only passed with about 300 votes. But at that time, there was federal money for transportation, and so I think 90% of the cost of MARTA was paid for by the federal government. And if we had missed that opportunity, we would not have MARTA. And without MARTA, there would be no Super Bowls, there would be no Olympics. You cannot bring an international event to a city that has no public transportation system. So it was very transformative. And the only reason it doesn't go more places is because the other counties would not vote for it. And even a couple of years ago, we tried to do a transportation. We tried to get Cobb County to vote to have MARTA coming out. Only Fulton and DeKalb have been willing to vote to do MARTA. And I think just recently Clayton County came on board, but 5 counties had the opportunity when the original legislation was proposed, and again, because of this issue of, black folk are going to take MARTA and come out to the suburbs, steal my TV, and get back on MARTA and go back.
That was the literature written.
And so this fear and this idea of keeping that the suburbs were supposed to be white and protecting them, unfortunately, has continued to be a factor in why we don't have the kind of regional transportation system that we should.